Hi, and welcome to Sleepy Roman History. If you're listening to this at night, I hope it helps you unwind. Please like and subscribe, it means so much to me. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it? It's so nice to think that wherever we are, we're sharing this moment together. Tonight, we follow the quiet rhythm of a Roman day. Not in the Senate or on the battlefield, but in a small workshop near the edge of a provincial town. Somewhere between the quiet flow of a river and the dusty stones of a market square, the forge has already begun to glow. The blacksmith rises early, before the forum fills with murmuring voices, before the baker's oven sends up its first ribbon of smoke. He is already at work. His shop stands between a potter's stall and a wine cellar's courtyard. Its roof is low, its stones darkened with age and soot. The wide doorway stays open, letting in the cool morning air, even as the hearth inside begins to heat. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of charcoal and iron. Hooks line the walls, each bearing tools of every size and shape. Tongs, chisels, hammers with worn wooden handles. Clay oil lamps flicker along the beams, their glow dancing across the anvil's smooth surface. The blacksmith is a large man, though not in height. His arms are thick, shaped by years of labor. His tunic is dark with old burns, his hands calloused and careful. He moves with the kind of slow precision that only comes from doing the same task 1,000 times. Not mindlessly, but with a deep, almost meditative familiarity. He begins by stirring the coals with a long rod of bronze. Sparks jump and fall. The fire responds with a soft sigh as it wakes. The bellows built into the wall are pumped by a young assistant, perhaps a freedman or a son. The air roars gently into the flames. The forge glows orange, then white. The first task is simple. Nails for a local carpenter, a few dozen shaped from iron bars delivered days before. The blacksmith slides one into the fire until it softens and glows. Then he lifts it to the anvil and begins to strike. The hammer falls with a steady rhythm, not loud, but firm. One strike, then another, each one shaping the metal with grace. Outside, a merchant leads a mule past the shop. The creature snorts at the sparks, but the merchant only nods in greeting. The blacksmith returns the gesture without words. There is no need. The day has begun, and his work is known. By mid-morning, the air inside grows warmer. Light pours through the doorway in long beams, catching the smoke as it swirls and lifts. The blacksmith pauses to drink water from a ceramic cup. He wipes his brow with the back of his forearm, then sets to work again. A farmer arrives, his tunic stained with soil. He carries a broken plowshare, the blade cracked, dulled by stones. The blacksmith listens patiently. He nods once. The farmer leaves it, knowing it will be ready in 2 days. No contract. No coin exchange just yet. Trust is enough. This is not a world of invoices and ink, but of memory and promise. In the corner of the shop sits a small altar to Vulcan, the god of fire and the forge. A simple thing, just a niche with a clay figure and a few pebbles arranged in a circle. Occasionally, the blacksmith glances toward it as he works. Not a prayer, just acknowledgement. A nod to the old powers that shape fire and hands and iron. Outside, the town begins to stir in full. Voices rise in the market. The clatter of carts mixes with the call of hawkers. But inside the forge, time moves differently, slower, measured in the soft rise of heat and the steady rhythm of the hammer. It is a world of sparks, sweat, and the quiet shaping of something useful. And all the while, the forge burns, not brightly, not wildly, just steadily, like the work, like the day, like the life of a man whose world is built, piece by piece, on the anvil before him. As the sun climbed higher over the rooftops, long shadows shortened and golden light poured more directly into the blacksmith's shop. The glow of the forge no longer stood alone. Daylight joined it now, warming the stones of the floor and illuminating the curls of smoke rising slowly from the hearth. Outside, the sounds of daily life began to hum more clearly. A child's laugh echoed down the street. A wheelwright called for help lifting a heavy rim. A flock of goats bleated as they were led across the cobbles toward the fields beyond the gate. The blacksmith did not look up from his work. These sounds were familiar, even comforting. They framed his rhythm. His assistant, a wiry youth with soot-streaked cheeks and quick eyes, returned from the fountain carrying a clay jug of water. He set it gently on a low table, then resumed working the bellows, his motions steady and practiced. Though young, he moved like one who had watched closely for years. The blacksmith nodded in approval. No words were exchanged. They were not needed. The boy knew when the coals needed more air, when the bucket should be filled, when to hand over the next piece of iron with tongs wrapped in cloth. It was a silent apprenticeship, taught not by lecture but by repetition and shared presence. Their next visitor was a woman, older, wearing a simple stola and a scarf pulled lightly over her head. She entered the shop with care, her sandals brushing dust along the threshold. In her hands she carried a broken brazier leg, thin and slightly twisted from long use. The blacksmith stepped away from the anvil and took the piece in his hands. He turned it gently, studying the break. The woman explained, in a voice touched with both pride and worry, that it had belonged to her father and she hoped to keep using it. The smith nodded again. He placed the brazier leg on a shelf to be mended that afternoon. She smiled once, bowed her head, and stepped out into the brightening street. This was the flow of the day, not frantic, but steady. A ploughshare in the morning, a brazier before noon, hooks for the fish seller's stall, a hinge for the olive press. Each item different, yet each shaped with the same patience. The blacksmith's world was not made of grand statues or shining weapons. It was made of the small, quiet things that held life together. The tools he used were few but trusted. The hammer, worn but balanced. The tongs, some long, some curved, each blackened with age. A chisel, its edge always kept sharp. And the anvil, broad and still, the center of his working world. Its surface shone in places where years of striking had polished the iron to a gentle gleam. Between tasks, the smith would sometimes step to the doorway, stretching his shoulders and breathing the air outside. He might exchange a word or two with a passing neighbor. Ask about a child's fever, share a comment on the weather, always a subject of importance for those whose days depended on clear skies and dry roads. The smells of the village wafted in, fresh bread from the baker's shop, rosemary from a nearby garden, damp wool from the fuller's workshop. Each one familiar, each one part of the fabric of this place. By late morning, the smith turned to work on a larger task, a new gate latch for the local temple's side door. The old one had rusted through after too many winters. The new one needed to be both strong and quiet. Worshippers would pass through it daily. It could not squeal or stick. He selected a thicker bar of iron and set it in the heart of the coals. Slowly, it turned bright orange. He lifted it carefully, placed it across the anvil, and began to shape it. This was the work he loved best. Not repair, but creation. A thing that did not exist yesterday, slowly emerging beneath his hands. Outside, the noon hour approached. The sun stood high. Shadows disappeared beneath eaves and carts. The sounds of the street softened again, as many paused for a midday meal or rest. Even the birds seemed to quiet. But in the forge, the work continued, steady as ever. The hammer's rhythm slowed only slightly. The fire still breathed, warm and constant. And the blacksmith, surrounded by tools, by flame, by the soft curve of rising smoke, bent once more to his task. He did not think of fame or fortune, only of the latch taking shape in his hands, of the iron giving way, not with violence, but with grace. As the sun reached its peak and the streets of the village grew drowsy, the blacksmith finally set down his tools. The hammer rested on its wooden stand. The iron bar, now shaped and cooling, lay beside the anvil. A soft hiss rose from the quenching basin as he dipped the tip of a tool into its water, then wiped his hands gently on a cloth hanging near the hearth. The forge, still warm, exhaled a gentle heat into the room. The flames, once bright and hungry, now settled into a slow, low burn. Even the bellows, left idle, creaked faintly as they rested in place. The shop seemed to exhale, taking a breath after the steady rhythm of the morning. Outside, the village had grown quiet. In the market, stalls were covered with linen cloths to keep the goods shaded. Children napped indoors. Animals huddled under trees or awnings. A stillness settled over the lanes and courtyards, like the hush between verses of a song. The blacksmith stepped out of the shop, stretching his arms above his head. The sky was a clear, bright blue. Cicadas buzzed in the heat. A cat wandered across the street, its body low to the cool shade of the wall. The forge behind him continued to breathe gently, but he left it untended for now. In the courtyard beside the shop, a fig tree grew. Its leaves were wide and dark, offering a canopy of deep shade. Beneath it stood a low bench, and a stone basin filled that morning with fresh water. The blacksmith dipped his hands into the basin, cupping the water and splashing his face. The chill was brief but refreshing. Drops rolled down his beard and fell quietly to the ground. His apprentice arrived a moment later, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were their midday provisions, a round loaf of bread, hard on the outside but soft within, a piece of goat cheese wrapped in vine leaves, 2 dried figs, and a clay jug filled with watered wine, cool from the shop's shaded wall. They sat in silence beneath the fig tree, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was no need to say it. The bread was torn, not sliced. The cheese shared without counting. The wine poured carefully into small clay cups, their rims worn smooth. Birds rustled in the tree above. The breeze stirred only faintly. From a distant field came the echo of a farmer's call, long and low. The blacksmith leaned back against the trunk, the bark rough but familiar. His eyes drifted upward, watching the light shift through the leaves. The apprentice chewed thoughtfully, glancing once toward the forge, then back to his cup. He admired the quiet, the stillness that came not from idleness, but from the pause between tasks. A moment earned. After they ate, the blacksmith unwrapped a small pouch and sprinkled a few seeds for the birds that visited his courtyard. Sparrows gathered cautiously, then more boldly, pecking at the offering with quick, nervous steps. This midday break was not long, but it was enough. Enough to rest the arms, to cool the face, to let the mind wander gently beyond the heat of the forge. In these quiet minutes, the smith remembered things: his mother's kitchen in a village far away, the sound of the river in spring, the rough laugh of a friend who had once worked beside him and now lived in another town. The apprentice rested with his head tilted back, eyes closed, listening to the rustle of leaves and the fading footsteps of a traveller on the road. When the sun began to tilt westward, the blacksmith rose. He shook out his tunic, wiped his hands once more, and returned to the shop. The apprentice followed, carrying the empty jug and the cloth now folded in neat quarters. The forge was waiting, the coals still warm, flared again with a few strokes of the bellows. The anvil glinted faintly as sunlight crept back through the doorway, and the rhythm of work resumed, not rushed, not delayed, just steady, as it had been, as it would be again. The forge returned to life with a low rumble. The bellows exhaled slowly, sending a gentle breath of air into the coals. They flared in response, glowing orange at first, then soft white at the core. The heat deepened. The air grew warm again, and the blacksmith's world of metal and fire resumed its quiet pulse. The blacksmith took up a bar of iron set aside earlier. Its surface bore the faint streaks of rust, but within it lay strength waiting to be awakened. He placed it into the heart of the fire and waited, watching it closely. Not for a clock, but for colour. When the iron glowed the right shade of yellow-orange, he would know. Outside, the light had softened. Afternoon brought a new rhythm to the village. Children's voices returned. The hum of commerce picked up once more. A potter's wheel spun in a nearby stall. A neighbour called out to another, her voice carrying a song-like cadence. The latch for the temple was nearly finished. The blacksmith lifted the heated bar, set it on the anvil, and began shaping its end into a curl. A few firm strikes, a twist with the tongs, a tap to smooth the curve. The iron yielded slowly, reluctantly, but willingly. It remembered his hands. He paused occasionally to inspect his work, turning it this way and that, watching the light catch on the surface. He liked things to be clean, to fit, to feel right in the hand. A tool or hinge made with care was not only more useful, but more beautiful, even if no one noticed. A customer arrived in the mid-afternoon light. A man in a wide-brimmed hat, his face lined with years of sun and wind. He carried a scythe blade wrapped in cloth. It had dulled from harvest and bore a chip along one edge. The blacksmith greeted him with a quiet nod, accepted the blade, and placed it beside the hearth. "It will be ready tomorrow," he said simply. The man smiled, gave thanks, and left with a few words about the weather, the yield, the state of the roads. All things known and worth speaking aloud. The apprentice worked nearby, hammering small nails into shape. His strikes were softer, less sure, but the blacksmith did not correct him. He let the rhythm settle. When needed, he would offer a small gesture, a tap on the wrist, a shift of the grip. No scolding, only guidance. A traveller paused outside the shop, drawn by the sound. He looked in, eyes curious. The blacksmith glanced up, gave the smallest nod, and returned to his work. The traveller, finding nothing to buy but much to watch, leaned on the frame for a while before moving on. The hours passed like this, slowly, gently, one task to the next. A hook shaped for a merchant's stall, a rivet hammered into a damaged cauldron, a long-handled poker for a neighbour who had just built a new hearth. These were the blacksmith's creations, not grand but necessary. Quiet things that held up the world. The forge was not a place of spectacle, it was a place of focus. The fire glowed, not with fury, but with warmth. The hammer did not crash. It sang. The anvil, marked with thousands of strikes, bore the memory of every task it had helped shape. In the last hour of the afternoon, the blacksmith lifted a nearly finished project. A new key for a storeroom lock. It was small, with a notched blade and a smooth handle. He ran a cloth over its surface, polishing it slowly. The metal was dark and clean, and when he set it down, it made no sound. Outside, the shadows grew longer. The breeze cooled. The sky began to turn, shifting from gold to the first hints of blue. The blacksmith stepped to the door again and rested his hands on his hips. He looked out across the square, watching as villagers passed by, returning home, their footsteps slower, their baskets full. He breathed deeply. The scent of hot iron clung to his tunic. His face bore a light sheen of sweat. His hands were tired, but the day was nearly done. He turned back to the forge, lifted the tongs, and placed the final piece of iron into the coals. There would be time for rest, but not just yet. The last task of the day was a simple one, but no less important. A small bracket for a lantern to be hung just outside the local bathhouse. It would hold a clay oil lamp, its flame glowing each evening as citizens came and went in the cooling dusk. The blacksmith shaped it carefully. A small loop curled outward from the iron bar, wide enough to cradle the base of the lamp. A second curve reached back toward the wall, designed to hold firm against the stone. It was nothing grand, yet he gave it the same attention he would have given a more complex hinge or tool. Each piece of iron bore his mark, not a stamp but a memory of his hands, his weight, his patience. The apprentice watched closely as the master worked. His eyes followed the movement of the hammer, the way the iron responded to each strike, the timing of the quench, the moment the glow faded in a hiss of steam. These lessons could not be written down. They were learned only by being present, by hearing the rhythm of the day, by breathing the air of the forge. When the bracket was finished, the blacksmith turned to the bench and began to clean his tools. Each hammer was wiped with cloth. The tongs returned to their pegs. The chisels and punches were set into a wooden drawer, lined with straw to keep the edges from dulling. Even the smallest brush had its place. The apprentice swept the floor with a bundle of reeds, gathering the day's dust, the blackened ash, and the faint glimmer of metal filings. He moved slowly, almost dreamily, the weight of the day settling into his limbs. The air inside the forge had cooled slightly, the fire banked but still warm. Its light flickered low across the stone floor. In the quiet that followed the last strike, the blacksmith stood still for a moment, his arms at rest, his mind steady. He looked around the room, not for inspection, but in appreciation. The forge had held its shape. The tools had served well. The fire had burned without fuss. It had been, as always, a good day. Outside, the light began to fade. The sun dipped behind the hills beyond the village, casting long shadows over the square. The first lanterns were being lit along the colonnade. Their glow was soft, amber, comforting. A familiar hush settled over the neighborhood. The blacksmith stepped outside and poured the remaining water from the jug onto the small courtyard plants. A pot of thyme, a stretch of rosemary. He rubbed a leaf between his fingers and breathed in the sharp, calming scent. Inside, the apprentice added a few coals to the hearth and pulled the metal cover across the open mouth of the forge. The fire would be preserved overnight, smouldering beneath the ash, ready to wake again at dawn. The blacksmith turned to the altar to Vulcan. The little clay figure stood in its niche, unchanged by time. He placed a fresh sprig of laurel at its base, a small, quiet offering. There were no prayers spoken, only a pause, a breath, a nod. The door to the forge was closed gently. The iron latch clicked into place. Outside, the streets were nearly empty now. A dog curled in the shade of a pillar. A boy chased a ball of rags past the well. Above, the sky deepened into violet. The blacksmith and his apprentice walked together down the lane, their sandals brushing the worn stones. The forge, behind them, stood dark once more, waiting, resting, dreaming in its own way. The village slowed. Lamps flickered behind windows. A final call from a street seller faded into silence. Somewhere nearby, a lyre strummed a slow melody, and within that hush, the day's work dissolved into the quiet peace of evening. In the forge, the tools did not speak, yet they were never silent. Each one carried a story, a memory, 1,000 small echoes of past work. They rested along the walls, hung on pegs of oak, or lay in drawers lined with straw. Their edges dulled and sharpened, their handles worn smooth by years of touch. The blacksmith knew them all by feel. He reached for each without looking. Like a musician tuning an instrument, he trusted his hands to find what was needed. The hammer was first among them. He had several, each for a different purpose. One was heavy and broad, used for shaping thick bars. Another was smaller, used for delicate bends and finishing touches. The heads were forged from iron, their handles made of ash or beech, wood chosen for its strength and give. When he held a hammer, the weight settled naturally into his hand. It was more than a tool. It was an extension of thought, of will. He did not strike with force alone, but with rhythm, with care. Next came the tongs, long iron arms bent into different shapes, some with flat jaws, others curved like hooks. They were used to hold hot metal safely, to twist and turn it in the fire, to steady it on the anvil. Over time, they too bore the marks of the forge, a bit of rust along one hinge, a slight bend in one arm, imperfections that did not hinder but told of faithful service. Chisels lined one side of the workbench, long and short, thin and wide. Their tips gleamed faintly, polished from use. These were for cutting, for splitting, for carving lines into hot metal. When used carefully, they made sounds like whispers against the iron. There were punches too, small cylindrical tools for making holes, hooks for turning, awls for scoring lines, files for smoothing rough edges, brushes for clearing debris. A quiet crowd of instruments, each with its own part to play. Near the hearth sat a few moulds, made of clay or sand or carved stone. These were used less often, but always kept close. When coins or buckles or decorative fittings were needed, the blacksmith would pour molten metal into them, then wait as it cooled into shape. The moulds were old, some handed down from his own teacher, their surfaces etched with faint patterns. On the shelf sat bowls of oil, olive and flax, used to coat tools and prevent rust. Bits of cloth were tucked beside them, their corners darkened with long use. Everything had a place. Everything was in its place. The apprentice was learning the names and weights of each tool. The blacksmith sometimes tested him, silently pointing to one across the room. The boy would fetch it, eyes focused, hands steady. At first, he made mistakes, brought a punch instead of a chisel, a thick hammer when a narrow one was needed. But over time, the mistakes lessened. The rhythm settled. There was no shame in error, only a quiet correction, a look, a gesture, then back to work. The anvil sat in the center of it all, broad, low, and worn. Its surface bore thousands of small impressions, like a field after a soft rain. Its horn curved outward, used for bending, its sides flat, for straightening. It did not move, it did not speak, but it listened, it received. At the end of each day, the tools were cleaned, wiped, returned. The forge was not abandoned, it was honored. To leave it messy would be to leave the work unfinished. And so, the blacksmith moved among these companions with calm. No need for haste, no room for distraction. The tools did not demand. They waited, and when called upon, they responded with trust. They were not grand or gilded, not displayed in temples or paraded in the streets, but in their simplicity lay something sacred. A quiet partnership between hand and metal, between work and rest, between the rhythm of the hammer and the silence that followed. In the forge, the blacksmith was never alone. The forge thrived on opposites: heat and cool, light and shadow, softness and strength. And at the center of all this quiet balance was the iron itself. Not gold or silver, not bronze or marble, but iron, plain, dark, and powerful in its patience. It arrived at the blacksmith's shop in long, rough bars. Some brought from the hills nearby, others traded from far provinces. The iron bore a coarse texture, dark grey or nearly black. When lifted, it had weight, not just of substance, but of potential. Within each bar was the promise of 100 shapes, waiting only for heat and will to draw them forth. The blacksmith stored the bars against the back wall, stacked neatly beside a row of timber and clay jars. Some were short, ready for nails or hinges. Others longer, used for ploughshares or gates. He chose carefully, not by appearance, but by feel. Some iron bent more easily, some held an edge longer. Each piece spoke differently when placed into the fire. There was also bronze in the forge, though used less often. It melted at a lower heat, flowed like honey, and was suited to finer things: pins, brooches, fittings for furniture. The blacksmith kept it in small ingots, smooth and warm to the touch, their golden colour catching the lamplight on quiet evenings. Charcoal fed the fire. Not wood, not coal, but charcoal, made from branches burned low and slow in covered pits. It burned hot, clean, and long. Each morning, the apprentice carried a basket of it into the forge, filling the hearth with dark, brittle pieces. When lit, they glowed with a deep inner orange, almost like breathing embers. The blacksmith kept a basket of limestone powder nearby. A pinch added to the fire helped the impurities in the metal rise to the surface. He used it sparingly, like salt in cooking. Just enough, never too much. Water played its part as well. In a large basin beside the hearth, cool and still, it waited. When the hot iron was plunged into it, a sharp hiss rose, and steam curled toward the rafters. The sudden cool strengthened the metal, setting its shape, locking in its memory. This process, quenching, was done with precision. Too soon, and the iron might crack. Too late, and it would not harden. Timing, as always, was everything. Sometimes, the blacksmith used oil instead of water for quenching, especially when working with thinner pieces. The oil hissed more softly, its steam sweet and fragrant. The finished pieces bore a darker sheen, smooth and resistant to wear. Sand was scattered across the floor in places. It caught stray sparks, soaked up oil, and softened the fall of tools. It too was part of the forge. Not grand, not complex, but necessary. All these materials, iron, bronze, charcoal, limestone, water, oil, sand, surrounded the blacksmith as he worked. They were not just supplies, they were elements. They had their own character, their own silence. Each one carried the weight of time and the promise of form. He treated them with care. Not reverence, perhaps, but respect. He did not waste them. He did not rush them. He worked with them, not against them. There was beauty in that, in knowing the feel of a bar of iron before it was heated, in reading the fire by its color, in hearing the sizzle of water and understanding what it meant. The blacksmith did not speak of these things, but they lived in his hands, in his posture, in the way he paused before the first strike, in the way he turned the metal, listening, watching, waiting. This was his world, not of marble and myth, but of matter and fire, a world built not on story, but on substance. And in that quiet world, the blacksmith shaped what others needed, what they carried, what they trusted, what they used and held and passed down. Iron was not precious like gold, but it endured, and so did he. The blacksmith's forge did not stand alone. It was part of the village, nestled among other workshops and small homes, near the winding main road that led from the market square to the fields beyond. Its doorway was always open, not as an invitation, but as a presence, a steady warmth that reached into the life of the town. Every day, people came, some with tools to mend, others with orders to place, many with nothing more than a question, a story, or a moment to rest in the shade by the doorway. One of the first regulars was the carpenter, a quiet man, older than the blacksmith, with hands as gnarled as olive branches and the smell of pine wood in his clothes. He brought chisels to be sharpened, hinges for cabinets, iron nails by the handful. The two men rarely spoke more than a few words, yet they worked in harmony. Each understood the other's pace. The carpenter's wood needed the blacksmith's iron, and the blacksmith's iron often found its final form in the carpenter's hands. Then there was the wine seller, younger, livelier, always in motion. He arrived with wagons that rattled and jugs that clinked. He needed hoops for his barrels, hooks for his cellar racks, sometimes a new tap for a wine cask. He paid in coin or in kind, always generous, sometimes bringing a small amphora of his newest blend. The blacksmith would nod in thanks and tuck it beneath the workbench to cool. A mother from the edge of town came once every few weeks, carrying small household items in her apron, a cooking tripod with a bent leg, a broken knife blade, a loose hinge from her garden gate. She never stayed long, but always left behind a smile and a scent of rosemary that lingered after she passed. Children too were common. They paused in the doorway, eyes wide, drawn by the red glow and the steady clang. Some dared to ask questions. Most simply watched. The blacksmith didn't mind. He worked as he always did, letting them see the rhythm, the fire, the transformation. One boy brought him a bent copper coin, asking if it could be made new again. The blacksmith chuckled softly and gave him a small nail in return. "Stronger than silver," he said. The village priest visited on rare occasions, usually for repairs to the temple gates or stands for oil lamps. He spoke with a soft voice, and his sandals always left traces of the gravel path from the sanctuary. He brought not only requests, but blessings, quiet words, a hand raised briefly over the forge. The blacksmith nodded, accepting the gesture without reply. Both men understood that sacred things could live in silence. Travelers passed through as well. Not many, but enough to remind the village of the wider world. Some sought horseshoes, others arrowheads or belt fittings. The blacksmith offered what he could. Sometimes he sent them away with directions, or with the name of a friend in the next town. He asked no questions, but listened carefully to the stories they offered. News of distant provinces, weather in the mountains, the price of grain near the coast. And then there were the neighbours, those who brought no work, only words. They stopped to lean on the doorframe, to share a thought, to offer news of a wedding, a birth, A funeral. They stood quietly while the blacksmith worked, the anvil ringing softly beneath their voices. It was enough just to be present. In this way, the forge became more than a place of labor. It became part of the village's breath. It warmed tools and stories alike. It received the broken and returned the useful. It listened. It waited. It gave without fuss. And through it all, the blacksmith remained steady, quiet, a presence of iron and fire woven into the daily life of those around him. He did not seek to be remembered, only to be useful, and in that he was. The boy arrived at the forge not all at once, but gradually. First, he stood in the doorway. Then he brought water. Eventually, he stayed long enough to watch an entire piece take shape. His name was Lucius, though the blacksmith rarely said it aloud. He called him simply boy or here, and the boy answered without complaint. Lucius was perhaps 11 years old when he began his quiet education. He was small for his age, with dark curls that clung to his forehead and a tunic that hung a little too long past his knees. His sandals were often dusty, his hands always in motion, tugging at a loose strap, wiping soot from his face, steadying a cup on the workbench. He learned not by instruction, but by imitation. The blacksmith did not offer lessons. He offered presence. Lucius watched, listened, waited, when to feed the fire, when to pull the bellows, how the iron changed colour in the heart of the coals. He began to know these things without needing to ask. His first tasks were small: sweeping the floor, filling the water basin, sorting the tools after they cooled. He handled them as if they were alive. The blacksmith noticed. Over weeks and months, the boy learned to hold the tongs properly, to lift a bar of metal without burning himself, to strike not with force but with rhythm. His hands grew stronger, his arms more sure, still thin, still young, but beginning to understand the weight of his labor. The blacksmith never praised loudly, but when a rivet was shaped cleanly or a hook bent with a smooth curve, he would place a hand on the boy's shoulder just for a moment. That was enough. Sometimes Lucius asked questions, not too many, always softly. Why the hammer was shaped that way, why one kind of iron bent and another cracked. The blacksmith would answer, but briefly. That one holds better in the cold, or it remembers too quickly. Answers that made sense only within the walls of the forge, where fire and silence shaped understanding more than words ever could. The boy's mother came by once, bringing a piece of bread wrapped in linen. She stood just outside the doorway, watching him for a while. When the blacksmith nodded to her without speaking, she seemed content. Lucius returned to his work without looking up. With time, the boy began to develop his own habits. He checked the bellows before dawn. He counted the charcoal. He laid out the tools in the order he thought the day might require. When he made mistakes, the blacksmith corrected them, not with anger, but with repetition. Again, he would say, and Lucius would try again. On quiet afternoons, the blacksmith let the boy shape nails, not for customers, just to practice. Lucius would line them up on the bench, crooked at first, then gradually straighter. His fingers grew calloused. His arms stopped aching. He began to dream of the forge, of hissing water and glowing iron, of the weight of the hammer and the scent of hot metal. In those dreams, he worked beside the blacksmith, not as a boy, but as a man. He never told anyone. The seasons passed slowly, one harvest, then another. The boy grew taller. His hands grew surer. His voice, still soft, carried more confidence when he spoke. The blacksmith noticed, but said nothing. He simply handed over a hammer one morning, not the smallest one, but the next in size. Lucius accepted it without question, wrapping his fingers around the handle with care. In time, the boy would become a man, the apprentice would become a smith. But for now, he remained between things, learning the rhythm of the forge, one breath, one strike, one glowing piece of iron at a time. And in that slow, patient way, the future was shaped. Not all at once, but steadily, like metal in fire. The forge did not know seasons, but it felt them all the same. The blacksmith worked year-round, yet each part of the year brought a different rhythm to the day. The changing light, the weight of the air, the texture of the smoke, all shifted as the months passed quietly, one into another. In summer, the heat was thick and unmoving. The forge, always warm, became a furnace of stillness. Even in the earliest morning hours, the air clung to the skin. The bellows, when pressed, sent out bursts of heat that wrapped around the arms and neck. Sweat rolled down the blacksmith's back before the first hammer fell. The apprentice placed bowls of water near the doorway, refilling them often. He wet cloths and laid them along the bench. They worked more slowly in the hottest weeks, letting the forge breathe longer between tasks. The hammer strikes were softer, spaced apart, like the slow tolling of a distant bell. Still, the work did not stop. There were ploughshares to mend before the late harvest, locks to fit, buckets to band. The summer months brought long days, and with them, long lists of requests. Farmers needed tools. Merchants needed fittings for wagons. The temple required lantern hooks for the evening processions. The forge opened earlier and closed later, but always with rests in between. Beneath the fig tree, beside the cool water jar, beneath a woven cloth that shaded the courtyard. Even the iron seemed to move more slowly in the heat, softening more easily, but also resisting the final hardening. Timing became everything. Then, without announcement, the seasons began to shift. The air cooled, the mornings smelled of earth and leaves. Autumn arrived like a guest who knew the way. In these months, the forge felt almost pleasant. The fire no longer competed with the sun. The smoke rose cleanly into the sky. The village came alive with preparation, oil stored, grain threshed, wood stacked high. The blacksmith's work reflected that change: thicker iron, longer projects, fewer repairs, more creation. There was peace in these days, a sense of balance. The forge glowed warmly in the crisp air. The hammer strikes echoed more clearly through the lanes. Children returned to school. Neighbours spoke more slowly, pausing to breathe the scented air. The blacksmith and his apprentice often worked into twilight. Lanterns lit early, their glow steady on the darkening stones. And then came winter. The mornings began in silence. Frost rimmed the anvil. The forge, when first lit, puffed out slow breaths of steam. The coals took longer to catch. The iron, colder and more brittle, needed careful handling. Sparks flew like tiny stars, brighter against the dim. Fewer visitors came. The roads became slick, the fields bare. Yet the blacksmith's shop remained open. The warmth inside became a comfort, a place of welcome. A neighbour might step in just to warm her hands. A boy from the school might pause to watch the fire, cheeks red from the cold. The apprentice gathered pine branches to stoke the fire. The scent filled the room. The blacksmith wore heavier cloth, his sleeves rolled but not tied. The hammer felt heavier in the cold, though his arms had not weakened. Winter work was different. More maintenance, fewer commissions, old tools repaired, doors refitted, iron brackets checked for cracks. Time moved slowly, but still moved. The blacksmith used the quiet hours to repair his own tools. He replaced a chisel's handle, sharpened the curve of a worn punch, cleaned the soot from the molds with a careful hand. He spoke more during these days, offering the apprentice lessons, not just in technique, but in patience. "Let the fire lead," he would say. "Don't hurry it." When spring came, it did so softly, not with a trumpet, but with a bird song, a hint of green on the tree, a softer breeze through the open door. The forge adjusted again, the work picked up, the rhythm resumed. In this way, the blacksmith marked time, not in calendars or festivals, but in the breath of the forge, the sound of the bellows, the way iron responded in the hand. Seasons passed, years passed, but the fire remained. The anvil stood, and the blacksmith's quiet rhythm continued, steady as the earth turning beneath his feet. Not all work at the forge was about creation. Much of it was repair, the steady, thoughtful restoration of things already loved, already used, already worn down by the passage of days. This was a task the blacksmith understood deeply, for he too had grown used to the slow wearing of time. A cracked door hinge, a bent shovel blade, a brazier leg that refused to stand straight. These were not grand projects. They did not earn praise or attention, but they mattered. Each repair began with examination. The blacksmith would hold the item in his hands, turning it slowly, feeling the weight and balance. He did not ask how the damage had occurred. He only looked, felt, listened to the small shifts of metal under his fingers. He did not rush. Then came the fire. The forge welcomed the broken piece with the same warmth as new iron. Heat softened what was stiff. The hammer reshaped what had bent. The anvil received each strike with calm. Sparks rose, but not angrily. They floated upward like fireflies, each one vanishing into the dim light above. Sometimes the object required more than metal. A rivet needed replacing. A wooden handle had cracked and must be carved anew. These tasks were done with the same care. Slowly, softly, without fanfare. The apprentice was learning these rituals. He watched as the blacksmith mended a rusted latch, straightened a bent horseshoe, fit a patch to a broken chain. He marveled not just at the skill, but at the quiet reverence with which the work was done. Nothing was hurried. Everything was given the time it deserved. One morning, an old man brought in a kettle. It was dented and dark with soot. Its handle wobbled, held in place by a bit of string. He explained in a voice dry as parchment that it had belonged to his wife. She had cooked with it every day. She was gone now, and he didn't use it much, but he wanted it to sit straight on the hearth. The blacksmith took it gently. He did not ask more. He reshaped the rim, fitted a new handle, smooth and strong, cleaned the base. When the man returned, he held it for a long moment before speaking. "It feels like hers again," he said. The blacksmith only nodded. Another time, a boy brought in a broken toy, a little cart with iron wheels, one snapped clean through. His face was solemn. He did not speak. The blacksmith studied it, then repaired it with a tiny rod, welding it carefully so the wheels spun true once more. The boy grinned when he saw it move again. He ran from the shop without a word, joy trailing behind him like a ribbon. These small moments filled the day. They were not dramatic. They did not make stories for the square, but they mattered. The blacksmith believed in the worth of mending, in giving things a second life, a hinge that held, a blade that cut clean again, a gate that opened with ease. Even tools in the forge needed care. He spent quiet evenings filing the edge of a worn chisel, tightening the head of a loose hammer, brushing soot from the tongs. Each tool, like each item brought to him, held years of service. He honored that service by keeping them ready. The apprentice learned to do the same. He polished nails before placing them in a jar. He sharpened hooks. He cleaned the forge floor not just to tidy, but to prepare it for the next day's steps. To mend was to believe in continuity, in what could last if cared for. The blacksmith did not speak of this belief, he lived it. Each repair was a quiet prayer to time, to usefulness, to the gentle strength of enduring things. And as the sun moved across the stones outside and the light shifted at the doorway, the forge continued its steady breath. Not only a place of fire and force, but of healing, of returning, of setting right what had been worn. As the sun began its slow descent behind the hills, the forge took on a different light. The strong beams of afternoon softened into gold, then amber, then a quiet blue. The shadows lengthened across the floor. The smoke from the hearth thinned and drifted lazily upward. The fire, no longer fed for fresh work, began to quiet itself, curling down into coals. Evening in the village was a time of stillness, not of silence. The sounds changed, from the hammer's rhythm to the soft sweep of a broom, from market shouts to low conversation, from the cry of carts to the hush of sandals against stone. The blacksmith stood at the doorway of the forge, arms folded, watching as the sky shifted colour. The rooftops caught the last warmth of the day. A woman passed, carrying a clay jar, nodding gently in greeting. A child ran past, chasing a hoop. Somewhere, a lyre plucked out a quiet tune. Behind him, the apprentice moved carefully, wiping down the bench, folding cloths, sweeping bits of filings into a corner basin. He knew these motions well by now. They were the soft coda of the day's work, the slowing of breath, the return to calm. The blacksmith turned back into the forge. The tools, once scattered in motion, had returned to rest. Tongs hung in even rows. Hammers sat in their cradles. Nails, sorted by size, lay in small ceramic pots. Even the water basin had been skimmed and covered with cloth to keep out dust. The final task was to bank the fire. The apprentice brought a small scoop of ash, pouring it gently over the glowing coals, not to extinguish them, but to cradle them, to keep them sleeping until morning. The fire hissed softly, its bright orange fading to a deep red, then to a pulse beneath grey dust. The blacksmith lowered the iron lid over the hearth, fitting it with a slow, careful motion. A few embers glowed through the gaps, their warmth steady and quiet. Outside, the temple bell rang once, not loud, but clear. A sound that marked the day's end, just as the morning light had marked its beginning. The blacksmith stepped to the shrine in the corner of the forge. The little altar to Vulcan sat as always, its small lamp nearly spent. He lifted a fresh wick into the oil, lit it with a taper, and watched the flame catch. It flickered once, then held. He did not kneel, he did not speak, but he stood for a moment in silence, head bowed slightly, letting the stillness settle around him. The god of fire and forge had been kind today. The work had been good. The metal had bent when asked. The tools had held. The hands had remained strong. The apprentice stood beside him, waiting. Together, they stepped into the courtyard. The fig tree rustled gently in the wind. A few birds called from the eaves. The blacksmith dipped his hands in the water basin one last time, letting the cool rise up to his elbows, washing away the sweat and soot. They sat for a moment on the low bench. The boy picked at a crust of bread from earlier in the day. The blacksmith leaned back, eyes half closed, watching the stars begin to pierce the soft sky above. No words passed between them. There was no need. A dog barked in the distance. A door closed. The breeze stirred the ashes inside the forge, whispering through the tiny gaps in the stone. The village was quiet now, not empty, but peaceful. Each home preparing for rest, each lamp casting its soft glow through a curtain or doorway. The blacksmith rose, moving slowly. His knees creaked, his hands, so steady at the anvil, now folded behind his back. He walked to the shop's door, checked the latch, then paused once more to listen. He heard nothing, not even the coals. He smiled faintly and stepped away. The forge would sleep tonight, as it had for generations, as it would tomorrow. And in that sleep, the village rested too, wrapped in warmth, in quiet, in the slow breath of evening peace. Within the forge, not all creations left. Some stayed, some were too flawed to be used, others too cherished to be sold. Over the years, a quiet collection had gathered in the corners, on high shelves, and within a narrow cabinet by the wall. These objects carried stories. They held the shape of moments, of hands, of thoughts half-formed and carefully set aside. The blacksmith kept them not out of pride, but of memory. There was a small iron bird, shaped long ago as a gift for a child who never returned. Its wings were short, its beak blunt, but it sat proudly on its perch above the hearth. Dust gathered along its back. The apprentice had once reached for it, curious, and the blacksmith had simply shaken his head. "Not that one," he had said softly. On another shelf sat a set of keys, mismatched, unused, their locks long lost or forgotten. Some were large, the kind that might have turned in a temple gate, others small and delicate, perhaps meant for a jewelry chest or a diary. He ran a cloth over them sometimes, their weight oddly comforting in the palm of his hand. A broken sword hilt leaned in the corner, wrapped in old leather, its blade snapped clean. It had come from a traveller long ago who left it behind after asking for a new spade instead. The blacksmith never mended it. He did not know why. It simply stayed. There were test pieces too, early attempts at scrollwork, a hinge too tight, a nail with a crooked head. The apprentice once asked why they hadn't been melted down and reused. The blacksmith replied, "Because they belong here now." And that was enough. In the narrow cabinet were a few more delicate things, pieces of bronze and tin, fittings from old lamps, clasps from sandals. The drawers smelled faintly of oil and ash. When opened, they made a soft, sliding sound, like paper over stone. Each item, in its own way, marked time, not in years or seasons, but in effort, in presence. They were not trophies, they were reminders of quiet mornings, of difficult projects, of evenings when the fire refused to catch or the iron bent wrong. They held mistakes and discoveries alike. The blacksmith, in his quiet moments, would sometimes lift one of these pieces and sit with it, not to change it, not to work it again, just to hold it, to feel its weight, to remember the day it had come into being. The apprentice was learning to do the same. He too began to set aside things, a washer that fit too perfectly to part with, a twist of wire that caught the light just so, a chisel head worn into a shape no longer useful but beautiful in its own way. They did not speak of these collections. They were simply part of the forge, part of the rhythm, like the sound of the broom across the stones, like the sigh of the bellows in the morning. The forge was not only a place of work, It was a keeper of memory. The walls had heard hundreds of voices. The fire had seen the same hands return again and again. The floor had caught 1,000 sparks. Time, in the forge, did not pass. It settled. In these quiet hours, as night drew near and the village lights shimmered faintly across the square, the blacksmith felt the stillness of the forge most deeply. It was more than his workshop. It was a space held gently between effort and rest, between heat and cool, between doing and simply being. And in that space, shaped by tools and lit by the soft glow of memory, he found not just the strength of iron, but the softness of time. The blacksmith was no longer young. His strength remained, but it came from practice, not power. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His steps were slower in the morning. The forge felt warmer in winter and heavier in summer. Still, each day, he opened the door, swept the stones, stirred the coals, and listened for the quiet sigh of flame. He had never counted the years. The forge had seen them pass, one by one, marked only by the wear of tools and the deepening polish of the anvil. The work had never stopped, though its shape had changed. Fewer large commissions, more repairs, more teaching, less need to prove anything. Lucius, the apprentice, was now nearly a man. His shoulders had broadened. His strikes were clean. His instincts strong. He spoke more freely, asked better questions, and sometimes completed a task without waiting to be told. The blacksmith watched this with quiet satisfaction. He saw in the boy not a replacement, but a continuation. One afternoon, Lucius completed a gate latch from start to finish, measured, heated, hammered, shaped, quenched, and polished. He held it out for inspection. The blacksmith took it in hand, turned it once, and said nothing. Instead, he reached behind the bench and brought out a small iron stamp. It bore the mark of the forge, a curved line with a single dot like the setting sun on a horizon. He handed it to Lucius. "You may use it," he said. Lucius said nothing, but his eyes carried the weight of the moment. The mark was not required by law. It did not serve to advertise. It simply meant that the piece was part of this place, shaped by its fire, its tools, its silence. It was a gentle signature, given not for pride, but for memory. That evening, as the sun set low behind the hills, the blacksmith sat outside the forge. He ran his hands over his knees, feeling the knots in them, the roughness of skin shaped by decades of iron. He watched Lucius move through the motions he once performed himself, checking the fire, sorting the tools, sweeping the stone floor. There was no sadness in him, only quiet. He thought of the first piece he ever made, a simple hook for a neighbour's storeroom, bent too sharply at one end. It had taken him a full day. He remembered the shape of the fire that day, the feel of the hammer, the way the light caught the finished piece as he held it up to the sun. He thought of all the things he had made since then, some still in use, some long gone, but each one a step in the long road that brought him here. The forge would continue. He knew that now. Lucius would take it, not all at once, but piece by piece. The tools would pass from one set of hands to another. The fire would sleep and wake again. The village would come, as it always had, bringing nails to shape and hinges to mend. The blacksmith would remain for now, steady as the anvil, present in the fire's glow. But he no longer needed to strike every blow. He could sit in the doorway sometimes, watching, remembering, listening to the rhythm he had known so long. And in that slow surrender, he found something deeper than rest. He found the shape of legacy, not carved in marble or sung in story, but lived quietly, passed gently, like iron from fire to hand. The village settled under a gentle sky, its rooftops glowing in the last light of evening. The forge, long cooled, stood quiet and still. No hammer rang, no sparks rose. Inside, the tools hung in place. The coals, banked and dim, exhaled the faintest whisper of warmth. The blacksmith sat alone beneath the fig tree in the courtyard, a blanket draped across his shoulders. His hands, still strong, rested in his lap. The night air was cool. The stars, distant and steady, blinked softly above the rooftops. Lucius had gone home for the evening. He would return in the morning, as he always did. The forge would wake again with the light, and the work would begin once more. But for now, the blacksmith watched the quiet world around him. He thought of the fire not as heat, but as memory, how it had shaped each day, how it had asked for attention, for patience, for rhythm. It had been his companion, his challenge, his teacher. He thought of iron, plain, unglamorous iron, and how it had become more than just metal in his hands. It had become service, purpose, a way of being in the world. He looked around the shop, lit only by a single oil lamp. The shelves were in order, the tools at rest. The air smelled faintly of ash and rosemary. A breeze moved through the doorway, carrying with it the distant sound of a lyre and the low murmur of voices nearby. Everything felt in place. The forge would not last forever. One day the roof would sag, the tools would rust, the anvil might crack. But for now, it endured, as solid and steady as the stone beneath the blacksmith's feet. He breathed deeply. The night smelled of warm earth, of oil, of spent fire. He stood slowly and stepped back into the shop. He touched the anvil once, his fingers brushing its worn surface. He moved to the hearth, placed another scoop of ash over the coals, and drew the iron cover closed. The altar to Vulcan caught his eye. The small flame in the lamp flickered once, then held. He bowed his head briefly, then turned away. At the doorway, he paused and looked out once more. The village lay quiet, wrapped in shadow. A dog barked once in the distance, then was still. He closed the door gently. The latch clicked into place with a soft finality, and the forge, filled with the breath of years, the weight of labor, and the warmth of quiet memory, settled into sleep.